Have you ever had the strange feeling of reliving something that has already happened exactly the same way, the same conversation, the same setting, the same tone of voice, as if reality were being reproduced before you, frame by frame, even knowing that it makes no sense at all? That unsettling feeling of perfect repetition, almost as if someone had pressed replay on your life. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me until the end, because what you are about to discover may surprise you. This type of experience usually lasts only a few seconds, but the impact is intense. Your heart races, your mind tries to find a logical explanation, and at the same time, something inside you affirms with absolute conviction, this has already happened. And the most disturbing thing is not the sensation itself. It's the certainty that comes with it. A certainty so strong that, for a moment, you question reality itself. Did time repeat itself? Did your memory anticipate the future? Or is there something much deeper happening inside the human brain? The truth is that experiences like this are more common than most people admit. Many live through it in silence, thinking it's too strange to talk about, or even afraid of seeming exaggerated. But this phenomenon is not a sign of madness, nor a character flaw, nor a fertile imagination. It points to something fascinating and unsettling about how the brain constructs the reality you believe you are living now. We often think we see the world as it is, in real time, continuously and reliably. But the brain doesn't work exactly like that. It doesn't record reality like a camera. It interprets, anticipates, compares, fills in gaps, and above all tries to conserve energy. To do this, it uses patterns, predictions, and past memories as a basis for understanding the present. Most of the time, this system works so efficiently that you don't even notice. But, at certain specific moments, something goes wrong. When this happens, the mind can replay an experience as if it were already archived, even if it's happening for the first time. The present is treated as the past. Perception mixes with memory. And the result is that disconcerting feeling that reality is being copied by accident. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt that your own brain seemed a step ahead, or out of sync? These subtle flaws don't appear out of nowhere. They often emerge during moments of mental fatigue, stress, excessive stimulation, or when attention is divided. The brain goes into automatic mode, relies too much on internal shortcuts, and for a few seconds, the boundary between what is being experienced and what is being remembered becomes blurred. And that's exactly where the experience becomes so compelling. Because for the brain it makes sense even when, for you, it doesn't. What's most intriguing is that these experiences are rarely neutral. They come loaded with emotion. A strange familiarity, a slight discomfort, sometimes even a feeling of alertness. This happens because areas linked to emotion react before the rational part can assess what is happening. The body feels first. Logic comes later, if it comes at all. And this inversion makes everything seem even more real. Perhaps the most disconcerting thing of all is realizing that the reality you live in is not exactly the world as it is, but a version constructed, interpreted, and adjusted by your brain every second. When this system fails, even for an instant, it reveals something that is normally hidden: how much our certainties depend on invisible processes happening within the mind. And this is where the story starts to get really interesting. Because understanding why the brain reproduces reality by accident is, in fact, understanding how it decides what is real, what is memory, and what is merely an interpretation. And this completely changes how you perceive experiences that, until now, seemed merely strange or inexplicable. What follows will take us precisely inside these hidden mechanisms, where small errors can create great illusions. And perhaps that's exactly why sharing this kind of experience matters so much. Because when you realize you're not alone, that other people have felt the same strangeness, the same inexplicable certainty of repetition, something changes. What seemed isolated becomes part of a human pattern. So, if this topic resonates with you, if at some point in your life your brain seemed to reproduce reality without asking permission, leave a comment below about what touched you most or how you felt at that moment. Sometimes, writing about it helps more than you imagine, and it can help other people who are trying to understand what they've experienced. If this content is making you look at your mind in a different way, consider liking the video. This simple gesture shows that this type of reflection is worthwhile and helps this video reach people who may be going through the exact same thing right now, without being able to put it into words. Each like is like a silent signal saying, "This matters." Now, if you enjoy exploring these mysteries of the human brain, if you're curious about those moments when the mind fails, distorts, or reveals things that are normally hidden, subscribing to the channel is a way to continue this journey with me. Here, the idea isn't to give ready-made answers, but to open up space for better, deeper questions, the kind that make us rethink what we call reality. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. It's what allows these conversations to continue, deepen, and evolve. And while you think about this, while you remember if you've ever experienced something similar or begin to question how much you trust your own perceptions, we need to take the next step. Because understanding why the brain does this requires looking even more closely at how it processes the present. And that's exactly where things get even more intriguing. When we try to understand this type of experience, the first thing that needs to be debunked is the idea that the brain functions as a faithful mirror of reality. It doesn't. The brain doesn't observe the world and simply register what happens. What it does all the time is reconstruct reality from fragments. Sounds, images, bodily sensations, emotions, and expectations are combined in real time to create what you call now. And this construction happens so quickly and automatically that it gives the illusion that everything is continuous, stable, and reliable. In practice, the brain works like an invisible editor. It selects what deserves attention, discards what it considers irrelevant, and completes what is incomplete. This is why two people can experience the same situation and remember it in completely different ways. Each brain reconstructs the experience based on its own history, its own mindset, its own emotions, and even its physical state at that moment. Reality, then, ceases to be something absolute and becomes an internal version, adjusted to make sense. The problem, or perhaps the revelation, arises when this reconstruction process fails. Not dramatically but subtly. A small synchronization error is enough. Instead of treating information as something new, the brain fits it into an old pattern. It recognizes before analyzing. It feels familiarity before confirming. And when this happens, the sensation of repetition is born, as if reality were being reproduced by accident, like a replay that nobody asked for. This type of failure doesn't mean the brain is broken. On the contrary, it reveals how much it depends on shortcuts to function. To deal with billions of stimuli every day, the brain needs to decide quickly. It predicts what will happen before it even happens. It bets on the probable. It relies on past experiences to accelerate future decisions. This mechanism is extremely efficient for survival, but it has a curious side effect. Sometimes the brain gets it right too quickly, and gets it wrong. When internal prediction precedes conscious perception, the present can be confused with the past. The feeling isn't "I remember this," but "this is already registered." It's as if the brain is saying, "Relax, I already know this path." But you, on the conscious side, know that you don't. This conflict creates discomfort, strangeness, and often that silent question that echoes inside, "What's happening to me?" This phenomenon gains even more strength when emotions come into play. Emotions accelerate decisions. Emotions shape how the mind interprets the world. When something triggers an emotional reaction similar to a previous experience, the brain can connect these two situations, even if they are not directly related. The result is a hidden truth. The brain trusts the feeling of familiarity more than logic. It believes what seems known even if it is wrong. And that's where the reconstruction of reality becomes even more delicate. Because instead of checking the facts, the brain relies on internal signals. A similar tone of voice. An environment with the same lighting. A specific smell. A similar emotional state. These details act as silent triggers. They tell the brain, this is the same. But the same is not the same as identical. Still, the brain prefers to decide quickly rather than with absolute precision. This dynamic reveals something profound about transformation and mindset. Many of the decisions you make every day are not based on the present, but on past versions of reality that the brain believes it recognizes. This applies to relationships, career choices, judgments about people, and even about yourself. The brain reproduces patterns because they save energy. However, when these patterns are not questioned, they shape the entire journey without you realizing it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why the brain reconstructs reality in this way requires looking behind the scenes of mental processing. It's not just memory. It's not just perception. It's the constant interaction between expectation, attention, and emotion. The brain doesn't wait for the world to happen before reacting. It anticipates. It simulates. It creates a provisional version of reality and only then adjusts. When it adjusts. When this adjustment doesn't happen in time, what emerges is this strange feeling of repetition, of copying, of something out of place. And the impact of this goes beyond the isolated moment. These failures reveal how fragile and malleable our experience of the world is. They show that what we call certainty is often just a convenient construct, not an absolute truth. Perhaps the most fascinating thing is realizing that the brain prefers a coherent story to a true one. If something seems to make sense within its internal patterns, it accepts it, even if external logic doesn't confirm it. This preference explains why false memories can seem so real, why impulsive decisions seem right at the moment, and why some experiences leave such a strong emotional mark, even without rational explanation. This is the kind of revelation that changes how you observe your own mind. Reality ceases to be a fixed stage and becomes a constantly evolving process. Nothing is simply given. Everything is being interpreted. And when the brain makes a mistake in this interpretation, it doesn't warn you. It simply delivers the finished experience, expecting you to trust it. And perhaps it is precisely this automatic trust that needs to be observed more carefully. Because the more you understand how the brain constructs, reconstructs, and sometimes reproduces reality by accident, the more you realize the impact this has on your choices, your judgments, and how you define what is real. This understanding is not meant to generate distrust, but awareness. An awareness that opens up space to question, adjust, and see beyond the first impression. All of this leads us to an even more sensitive point, where small internal flaws can create large external illusions. And it is precisely at this boundary between perception and decision that the mind reveals its most intriguing mechanisms. Before moving on, write a simple sentence in the comments just to record this moment. This makes sense to me. When we ask ourselves why the brain reproduces experiences, the answer begins far from any mystical or extraordinary idea. It begins with something very simple, almost banal. The brain hates wasting energy. It was shaped to survive, not to be perfectly accurate. Every decision, every perception, and every interpretation of reality has an energy cost. And to reduce this cost, the brain has developed a powerful strategy, using shortcuts. These shortcuts are patterns. Everything you've ever experienced, felt, decided, and learned becomes a huge internal database. When something new happens, the brain doesn't start from scratch. It compares the present with this file from the past. It silently asks, does this resemble something I already know? If the answer is yes, it speeds up the process. It decides faster. It interprets faster. It reacts faster. Most of the time this works very well. That's how you cross the street without calculating each step or understand a sentence before it's even finished. The problem arises when this comparison happens out of sync. When the brain identifies similarities before analyzing differences. When it recognizes an emotional, sensory, or contextual pattern and assumes that the rest of the experience will be the same. At that moment, the present is pulled into the past. Not as a clear memory but as a feeling of absolute familiarity. That's where the impression that this has already happened is born. This process is so fast that you can't consciously keep up with it. The brain decides before you even realize it has decided. It constructs an internal narrative and delivers it ready-made. And when you try to question it, the feeling is already in place. It's not a rational thought, it's a feeling. And feelings are difficult to challenge because they don't ask permission to exist. This energy saving explains why the brain prefers to repeat patterns rather than create new interpretations. Creating something new requires effort. Questioning requires effort. Revising a decision requires effort. Recognizing something as known brings comfort and speed. The brain is not concerned with absolute truth but with efficiency. This is a hidden truth that completely changes how we understand our own experiences. When you feel something repeating itself, it's not because time has gone back or reality has failed. It's because the brain has found enough similarities to trigger an old pattern. Could be a tiny detail, a tone of voice, similar lighting, a specific emotional state, a stress level similar to another past situation. These elements act as invisible keys that unlock old drawers in the mind. The curious thing is that the brain doesn't just compare facts, it compares internal states. If you are emotionally similar to who you were at another point in your life, the current experience can be interpreted as a continuation of that old one. This has a profound impact on your mindset and how you make decisions. Many choices that seem rational are, in fact, automatic repetitions of old responses. This dynamic doesn't only happen in strange or rare moments. It happens all the time. You trust people who resemble someone who was once important to you. You avoid situations that remind you of negative experiences, even if the context is different. You react emotionally before understanding rationally. All of this is part of the same mechanism. The reproduction of the experience is just the most visible version of something that happens behind the scenes of the mind all the time. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding these shortcuts reveals something transformative about our journey as human beings. The brain isn't trying to deceive you. It's trying to protect, conserve, and maintain coherence. It wants your life story to make sense, even if it needs to oversimplify reality to achieve that. When the comparison between present and past happens accurately, you don't even notice it. But when it happens out of rhythm, it feels strange. It's as if two timelines overlap for a moment. The brain acts as if it were in the past while you know you're in the present. This slight misalignment generates the sensation of repetition, of replay, of copying. This phenomenon also explains why these experiences often arise during times of overload. When you are tired, stressed, or emotionally demanding, the brain resorts even more to shortcuts. It doesn't have the energy for in-depth analysis, so it relies on what it already knows. The impact of this is not limited to the perception of reality. It affects decisions, judgments, and even how you interpret yourself. How many times have you felt trapped in recurring thought patterns? How many decisions have you made almost on autopilot, only to later realize you reacted as you always do? The brain loves to repeat what has worked before, even if it no longer does. This repetition creates a false sense of security, but it can also limit transformation. When reality seems to repeat itself, what's at stake isn't just a curious phenomenon. It's an invitation to observe how your mind constructs meaning. It's a silent revelation about how much you live within internal narratives that reinforce themselves. The brain doesn't ask if you want to repeat it. It simply repeats it because it's efficient. Understanding this changes your relationship with your own mind. Instead of blindly trusting every feeling of certainty, you begin to observe. Instead of assuming that something has always been this way, you start to question. This change in attitude has a direct impact on how you live, choose, and interpret the world. Not to create distrust, but to open space for awareness. And the more you observe these mechanisms, the more you realize that many experiences that seem extraordinary are, in fact, windows into the inner workings of the mind. Small errors reveal large structures. Small slips show how reality is constructed, maintained, and sometimes reproduced without warning. All of this sets the stage for understanding something even more delicate. The exact moment when the brain recognizes before analyzing and decides before you realize it. It is at this point that the feeling of repetition gains strength and the boundary between past and present becomes dangerously thin. Before moving on, leave a simple comment below just to mark this understanding. Write, "I'm on this journey too." It is precisely at this point that the phenomenon ceases to be merely curious and begins to reveal something deeper about the inner workings of the mind. Because the error doesn't happen in a crude way, nor as a collapse of the system. It happens silently, almost elegantly. A small internal misalignment, imperceptible to those looking from the outside, but powerful enough to completely distort the experience of those who are living through it internally. The brain functions like an extremely synchronized orchestra. Areas responsible for perception capture what is happening now. Regions linked to memory compare this information with past experiences. Emotional systems assess whether it represents a threat, safety, pleasure, or discomfort. When everything is in harmony, reality seems continuous, fluid, predictable. You simply live in the moment without questioning the process. But just a small delay in this communication is enough for the sensation to change completely. Imagine that the perception of the present moment arrives a few milliseconds after the emotional recognition. Or that the memory is activated before conscious analysis. This interval is minuscule, but the impact is enormous. The brain receives the information out of order. Instead of perceiving first and interpreting later, it interprets before perceiving. And when this happens, the experience reaches you already laden with meaning, familiarity, and certainty. This is the heart of the mystery. It's not hallucination, nor fantasy, nor overactive imagination. It's a processing mismatch. The pieces are all there, functioning. The problem is the rhythm. It's like listening to a song with the instruments coming in at the wrong time. The melody is still there, but something sounds strange. Something doesn't fit. And the brain, instead of signaling the error, tries to compensate by creating a narrative that makes sense. This compensation is an old strategy. The brain doesn't like gaps. It prefers an imperfect explanation to no explanation at all. So, when it realizes that something doesn't add up, it fills it in. It adjusts. It reconstructs. And it delivers the experience as if it were complete. It is in this automatic adjustment that the feeling of repetition, of replay, of "this has already happened," is born. Not because it happened, but because the brain needed to fit pieces that arrived out of order. What's most intriguing is that this internal misalignment is usually triggered in very specific states. Moments of transition, fatigue, emotional overload, situations where attention is divided between the external and the internal. At these times, the brain needs to make decisions too quickly with limited resources. It prioritizes emotion, then memory, then logic. And this inversion creates an intense, compelling, and at the same time, profoundly disconcerting experience. This type of glitch reveals a hidden truth about how we deal with reality. We don't access the world directly. We access an organized version that makes sense within our personal history. When this organization fails for a moment, we feel that something is wrong, but we don't know how to explain what. And this feeling of strangeness is often mistaken for something out of the ordinary, when in fact it is a side effect of an extremely complex system trying to maintain coherence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this misalignment doesn't just affect strange, isolated moments. It influences important decisions, quick judgments, and even how you construct your identity throughout life. When perception, memory, and emotion are misaligned, the brain may make decisions based on old emotional cues as if they were current. This has a direct impact on mindset, how you react to challenges, and how you interpret new situations as if they were old acquaintances. How many times have you felt resistance to something new without knowing exactly why? Or an immediate trust in someone you just met? Many of these responses come from the same mechanism. The brain identifies familiar emotional patterns and reacts before consciousness has time to assess the real context. The misalignment in these cases doesn't generate strangeness, it generates conviction. And automatic convictions shape entire journeys without us even realizing it. The phenomenon of reproduced reality is merely the most visible version of this process. It draws attention because it breaks the illusion of continuity. But, behind the scenes, the brain makes similar adjustments all the time, albeit more discreetly. It edits memories, reinforces internal narratives, and creates a sense of stability that doesn't always correspond to the facts. This stability is comfortable, but it can also hide limitations. When you begin to see these mechanisms, something changes. Not in the sense of distrusting everything, but of observing more closely. Of realizing that the mind is not an impartial judge, but a highly efficient storyteller. And like any good storyteller, sometimes it anticipates the ending before hearing all the facts. This habit has an impact. An impact on the choices you make, the opportunities you accept or reject, and even on how you deal with change and transformation. Internal misalignment also explains why these experiences are often so emotional. Emotion takes priority in the brain. It acts as a powerful shortcut for quick decisions. When emotion comes first, it colors everything that follows. Perception adapts to emotion, memory adjusts to the narrative, and logic tries to justify what has already been felt. This process happens too fast to be consciously perceived, but slow enough to generate internal conflict. This conflict is an invitation. An invitation to look more closely at how your mind operates when you're not paying attention to it. Because understanding these small errors isn't about controlling the brain, but about expanding awareness. It's about realizing that many certainties are temporary constructs, that many strong sensations aren't proof but signals, and that questioning these signals can open up space for more conscious choices along the journey. When the brain reproduces reality by accident, it's not actually malfunctioning. It's showing its workings. It's revealing how perception, memory, and emotion intertwine to create what you call the present moment. And the more you observe this process, the more you realize that the mystery lies not outside but within. In the small delays, the automatic adjustments, the stories the mind creates to keep everything functioning. This understanding sets the stage for something even more delicate, the role of emotion in this process and why it often takes control before logic can manifest itself. It is at this point that the impact of these failures becomes even deeper and more personal. Before moving on, leave a simple note in the comments, just to mark this moment of reflection. Right, this makes sense to me. When emotion enters the scene, everything takes on another dimension. It is at this point that these experiences cease to be merely strange and become intense, almost impossible to ignore. Because before you can think, your body has already felt it. Before logic tries to organize the facts, something inside you has already decided that it is real. This order is not random. It reveals one of the most important, and least questioned, gears in the workings of the human mind. The emotional brain reacts first because it was designed to do so. In terms of survival, feeling before thinking has always been an advantage. Emotion is quick. It's alert. It's immediate reaction. Logic, on the other hand, is slow, analytical, careful. It compares possibilities, reviews scenarios, seeks coherence. But when something happens unexpectedly, the brain doesn't wait for this review. It prioritizes the sensation. And the sensation arrives with full force. That's why, when reality seems to repeat itself, the experience comes with a physical certainty. A tightness in the chest, a shiver, a sudden tension. The body reacts as if it recognizes that moment. It's not a clear memory but a silent conviction. Something says, this is familiar. And when the body affirms this, the rational mind needs to scramble to try to explain it. This delay creates a curious effect. Logic does realize that something doesn't add up. It analyzes the context, looks for evidence, tries to argue. But it arrives too late. Emotion has already marked its territory. And most of the time, reason can't erase that mark. It may question, but it can't completely neutralize the feeling. The result is this internal conflict. You know something is wrong, but you feel it's right. This dynamic reveals a hidden truth about how we make decisions. Many of the certainties we hold don't stem from deep analysis, but from quick emotional reactions. Logic comes in later, often only to justify what has already been felt. This doesn't only happen in experiences that are strange to our perception of reality. It happens in important choices, in judgments about people, in changes of direction in life. When the emotional brain takes over, it doesn't ask for proof. It works with signals: familiarity, comfort, threat, security. If something triggers a known emotional signal, the brain reacts as if it already knows the outcome. And this reaction shapes the entire experience. Reality organizes itself around what was felt first. Logic then tries to adapt to this narrative, even when it encounters flaws. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding this priority of emotion helps explain why these experiences seem so compelling. It's not just what you see or hear. It's what you feel before you can even think. The emotional brain acts as an initial filter of reality. It decides the tone of the experience. If something seems familiar, everything around it takes on that color. If something seems threatening, even the neutral becomes risky. This mechanism has a huge impact on mindset. It creates emotional shortcuts that guide behavior throughout the entire journey. You might avoid paths that seem wrong without knowing why. You might trust decisions you can't rationally justify. You might feel something is true even when the facts say otherwise. All of this stems from this internal hierarchy where emotion speaks first. When reality seems to be reproduced, emotion enters as subjective proof. It says, "I recognize this." And the brain trusts it. This trust is so strong that, for a few seconds, logic loses ground. It's like trying to convince someone who is dreaming that it's not real. While emotion is active, rational argument finds no firm ground. This process also explains why these experiences are often so memorable. They don't go unnoticed because they involve the whole body. It's not just a strange idea, it's an experience. Something that leaves a trace. And this emotional trace reinforces the memory of the event, making it seem even more significant than it actually is. The brain learns with intensity, not with precision. This emotional learning influences future decisions. The next time a similar stimulus arises, the brain will remember the sensation, not the logical explanation. It will anticipate the reaction. And so the cycle reinforces itself. The emotion creates a pattern, the pattern becomes a shortcut, the shortcut shapes the experience. This is one of the most powerful backstage mechanisms of the human mind, and also one of the most invisible. When you understand this, you begin to realize that many certainties are constructed in this way. Not because they are true, but because they were felt with enough intensity to seem true. Logic then works as an adjustment tool, not a command tool. It comes in to organize the story after the feeling has already decided the course. This understanding doesn't diminish the emotion, but rather broadens awareness of its impact. It shows that questioning a feeling isn't about denying what you feel, but about understanding where it comes from. It's recognizing that the emotional brain plays an important role, but it doesn't need to be the only one driving decisions. This perception opens space for transformation, for more conscious choices, for a more honest relationship with one's own mind. When the brain reacts emotionally before logic, it's not making a mistake in the classical sense. It's following its oldest programming. The mistake, if there is one, lies in assuming that this reaction is absolute proof of reality. And it is precisely this assumption that creates such intense and, at the same time, disconcerting experiences. This point marks an important turning point in understanding the phenomenon. Because, from here on, it becomes clear that what we feel is not always a faithful reflection of what is happening. Sometimes, it is just an echo of old patterns being activated in the present. Understanding how these echoes are formed and why they have so much power over us requires looking even more closely at how the brain organizes time, memory, and identity. Before moving forward with this reflection, leave a simple note in the comments, just to mark this moment in the journey. Right, this makes sense to me. When we begin to observe these phenomena more closely, we realize that they are much more present in everyday life than we usually admit. They don't only happen in rare or extraordinary moments. They arise in the middle of routine, in common, almost banal situations, precisely when the mind is functioning automatically. And perhaps that's why so many people go through this and simply move on, without stopping to reflect on what really happened. Think about that strange feeling of reliving a moment. You're talking to someone, listening to every word, and suddenly you get the clear impression that that scene has already been lived exactly like that. It's not just a vague idea. It's as if your brain is saying, I know what's coming next. For a few seconds, you feel like you could anticipate the next sentence, the next gesture, the next movement. Even knowing that this is unlikely, the feeling persists. And the most curious thing is that it doesn't come with a clear memory of when it might have happened before. It's just the conviction. Or that experience of entering a new environment and feeling that it is strangely familiar. A place you've never been, but that seems all too familiar. The arrangement of objects, the light, the smell, the atmosphere. Everything seems to fit into some internal register that you can't consciously access. The brain reacts as if it were recognizing something, even without being able to pinpoint where this familiarity comes from. It's like walking through a scene that seems copied from a memory you can't locate. There are also conversations that seem scripted. Situations where the dialogue flows in such a predictable way that it gives the impression that it has already been rehearsed. You have the feeling that you have already heard those words, in that exact tone, in that specific sequence. Sometimes, a slight discomfort arises as if you were trapped in a scene that repeats itself. And, again, there is no concrete memory that explains this. Just the feeling of repetition. These examples are more common than people admit. Almost everyone has experienced something like this at some point in their lives. The difference is that not everyone stops to observe. Many dismiss it as a distraction, a coincidence, or simple tiredness. Others feel it, find it strange, and move on. But when you start paying attention, you realize that these experiences are part of a much broader pattern of how the mind works. The brain likes familiarity. It feels comfortable when it recognizes patterns. And therefore, it tends to look for similarities even where they are not so evident. When it finds elements similar to past experiences, it reacts as if it were revisiting something known. This reaction happens before consciousness has time to calmly assess the context. The result is this feeling of a copy of reality, even when the scenario is new. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because these everyday examples reveal something important about how we construct meaning. The brain doesn't differentiate as well as we imagine between real repetition and perceived repetition. If the set of stimuli is similar enough to something previous, it activates the same internal pattern. And this pattern comes loaded with emotion, expectation, and a sense of recognition. This has a direct impact on how we interpret the world. Familiar environments tend to seem safer. Predictable conversations give a false sense of control. Moments that seem repetitive create the illusion that we understand the situation better than we actually do. This illusion can be comfortable, but it can also be misleading. It influences decisions, judgments, and even how you approach new experiences. When you feel you've experienced something before, your brain relaxes. It believes it already knows how to handle it. And this belief changes your internal posture. You pay less attention to details. You react more automatically. You trust your feelings more than your analysis. Behind the scenes, your mind is saying, this isn't new, so it doesn't require as much care. But often this conclusion is premature. These experiences show how the mind works to maintain a coherent narrative throughout the journey. The brain prefers to believe that the world is predictable, that events follow a recognizable pattern. This reduces uncertainty, decreases anxiety, and saves energy. However, in doing so, it can transform coincidences into familiarity, similarities into repetition, and sensations into proof. That's why these experiences are so compelling. They don't arise as abstract thoughts but as complete experiences. You don't think something has already happened. You feel it. And when feeling comes into play, it colors everything around you. Reality seems to fit into that narrative even if rationally there are flaws. This is one of the most interesting revelations about how the mind works. It prefers a story that makes sense internally to a precise analysis of what is happening externally. The more you observe these common examples, the more you realize they are not exceptions. They are signs. Small leaks that show how the brain organizes time, memory, and perception. They indicate that the present is not lived in a pure way, but always filtered by past experiences, emotional states, and internal expectations. This filtering is constant. What changes is how much you perceive it. These situations also help explain why so many people describe these experiences similarly, even without ever having talked about them. It's not a coincidence. It's structural. The human brain works similarly in all of us. The shortcuts are similar. The mistakes too. And when these mistakes appear, they produce recognizable sensations, even if they are difficult to explain in words. Realizing that almost everyone has gone through this brings a different kind of understanding. It's not something personal nor exclusive. It's part of the normal functioning of the mind. And this changes how you approach these experiences. They cease to be merely strange and become clues. Clues about how reality is constructed, maintained, and sometimes reproduced without you realizing it. This more attentive perspective creates space for transformation. Not in the sense of avoiding these experiences, but of understanding them. Of understanding that feeling familiar doesn't necessarily mean repeating something. That recognizing is not the same as remembering. And that the brain, despite being efficient, is not always accurate. It works to maintain coherence, not to guarantee absolute truth. This understanding paves the way for observing something even more subtle. What happens when external factors such as stress, fatigue, and overload enter this equation and intensify these effects? Because when the brain is under pressure, these shortcuts become even more evident, and the impact on the perception of reality becomes even greater. Before moving forward in this reflection, leave a simple note in the comments, just to mark this connection. Right, I'm on this journey too. When stress, fatigue, and attention enter this equation, everything intensifies. Not because the brain breaks down, but because it changes strategy. In moments of overload, the mind stops operating in careful mode and starts functioning in economical mode. It's as if it were saying, now it's impossible to analyze everything in depth, so I'll use what I already know. And that's exactly when failures become more frequent and more convincing. Stress doesn't just affect mood or the body. It directly alters how the brain processes information. Under pressure, the mind prioritizes speed over accuracy. It needs to respond quickly, decide quickly, react quickly. To do this, it relies even more on automatic patterns that are already in place. The greater the stress, the less willing the brain is to review, check, and correct perceptions. It relies on shortcuts, even when the shortcut isn't the best path. Mental fatigue works in a similar way. When you're tired, it's not just your body that feels it. Attention becomes fragmented, analytical ability decreases, and the mind starts operating on autopilot. In this state, the brain reduces cognitive effort whenever possible. It stops observing details and starts filling in gaps based on what it has experienced before. And filling in gaps is exactly where these feelings of repetition, copying, and undue familiarity arise. Excessive stimuli also play a crucial role in this process. We live surrounded by information, screens, sounds, interruptions, and constant demands. The human brain was not designed to handle so many simultaneous stimuli. To survive this bombardment, it aggressively filters what it considers important. However, by filtering too much, it also oversimplifies. And this simplification increases the chance of confusing the new with the known. When attention is divided, perception loses sharpness. You see but you don't observe. You hear but you don't truly listen. You live in the moment but without full presence. In this state, the brain completes the experience based on expectations and memories. It assumes it already knows enough. And when it assumes that, it stops verifying. This is one of the most important hidden truths about attention. What you don't consciously observe, the brain decides on its own. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this mechanism explains why these experiences tend to happen precisely during specific phases of life or periods of greater pressure. Changes, important decisions, emotional overload, intense workdays. The more the brain is stressed, the more it relies on autopilot. And the more automatic it becomes, the greater the risk of confusing patterns with reality. This has an impact that goes far beyond strange and momentary experiences. It influences important decisions. When you are tired or stressed, you tend to repeat old choices even if they no longer make sense. The mindset becomes more rigid. The brain prefers the familiar to the unfamiliar, not because the familiar is better but because it requires less effort. This behavior shapes entire trajectories without the person realizing it. In states of overload, the brain also becomes more sensitive to emotional triggers. Small stimuli take on exaggerated weight. A vague feeling of familiarity can be interpreted as certainty. Mild discomfort can become a warning sign. Logic once again takes a back seat. And when this happens, the perception of reality becomes even more vulnerable to distortions. These failures are not a sign of mental weakness. They are a direct consequence of a system operating at its limit. The brain doesn't make mistakes because it's inefficient, but because it's trying to handle everything at once. It prioritizes survival, coherence, and energy conservation. Accuracy comes later, if there's room left. This understanding completely changes how you perceive these experiences. They cease to be something strange and become a reflection of the internal context. When you are rested, alert, and emotionally balanced, the brain is better able to compare the present with the past. It distinguishes nuances. It perceives subtle differences. It adjusts interpretations. But when you are tired, it doesn't perform this refinement. It generalizes. It groups distinct experiences into the same internal package. And this generalization is what creates the feeling that everything seems the same, repeated, or copied. This process also explains why, during periods of prolonged stress, some people report that the days seem the same, that time passes strangely, or that experiences lose their novelty. It's not the world that's repetitive. It's the brain that's operating in containment mode. It reduces the richness of perception in order to keep functioning. The impact of this on the personal journey is profound because it affects motivation, creativity, and the sense of meaning. When the mind is overwhelmed, it doesn't seek revelations. It seeks stability. And stability for the brain means predictability. Even if that predictability is illusory. Even if it's based on old patterns that no longer represent current reality. This is one of the most silent traps of mental functioning, confusing cognitive comfort with truth. Understanding the role of stress, fatigue, and attention in this phenomenon is an important step towards transformation. Not to eliminate these experiences but to contextualize them. To realize that often the feeling of repetition says nothing about the external world, but says a lot about the internal state. It is a sign that the brain is operating at its limit and resorting to the quickest resources it has. This understanding opens the door to a change in attitude. Instead of interpreting these sensations as something mysterious or unsettling, you can see them as indicators. Indicators of overload, of excessive stimuli, of fragmented attention. They function as a silent warning that the mind is too tired to analyze in depth. And the more you recognize this pattern, the more you begin to realize how it connects to everything that has been discussed so far. The shortcuts, the internal misalignment, the prioritization of emotion, the deceptive familiarity. Everything converges on the same point. The brain does the best it can with the resources it has at that moment. When these resources are compromised, the flaws become more visible. This broader perspective paves the way for something even deeper. Understanding what these flaws reveal about the nature of the reality we live in and how much we trust it without questioning. Because ultimately, when the brain errs more easily, it also reveals more about itself. Before moving forward with this reflection, leave a simple note in the comments, just to highlight this awareness. Right, this makes sense to me. When we put together everything that has been explored so far, a revelation that is difficult to ignore begins to emerge. These accidents of the mind are not just occasional glitches, strange curiosities, or noise in the system. They are clues. Very clear clues to something deeper about the human condition. The reality you live in is not a faithful copy of the world outside, but a version interpreted, edited, and constantly adjusted by the brain. This may sound uncomfortable at first glance, because we are taught to trust our senses as if they were precise instruments. Seeing would be synonymous with truth. Feeling would be proof. Remembering would be a guarantee. But when these experiences of repetition, undue familiarity, and mismatch occur, they expose a hidden truth. The brain is not committed to the absolute fidelity of reality, but to the internal coherence of experience. What you call reality is, in practice, the result of a constant negotiation between perception, memory, and emotion. The brain receives signals from the external world, cross-references them with past records, assesses the present emotional state, and constructs a narrative that makes sense in that context. This narrative is what you experience as now. When everything works well, this construction is invisible. But when something goes off kilter, even for milliseconds, the illusion shatters, and you realize that there's an active backstage operating all the time. These moments reveal that memory is not a static file, stored intact somewhere in the mind. It is dynamic, malleable, sensitive to the current context. Each time you access a memory, it is reconstructed, not merely retrieved. This means that the past is not revisited as it was, but reinterpreted in the light of the present. And, in situations of misalignment, this reconstruction can blend with current perception, creating a feeling of repetition or déjà vu. The same applies to perception. You don't perceive everything around you. You perceive what the brain considers relevant. The rest is inferred, completed, or simply ignored. This makes the experience of the world always partial, even when it seems complete. The brain fills in gaps based on old patterns, expectations, and beliefs. Most of the time this goes unnoticed. But when it fails, it reveals how much you depend on these inferences to feel that the world is stable. Perhaps the most profound impact lies in the trust we place in our own senses. These experiences show that feeling certain is not the same as being right. That emotional intensity is not synonymous with truth. That familiarity can be artificially constructed by the brain, without direct correspondence to external reality. This does not mean that the senses are not useful, but that they are not absolute judges. They are interpreters. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this realization changes how you understand yourself. If reality is an interpretation, then your reactions, decisions, and beliefs are also influenced by this invisible filter. Many convictions that you firmly defend may have originated not from solid facts, but from well-constructed internal narratives. Narratives that made sense at some point in your journey and that continue to operate behind the scenes. This has a direct impact on mindset. When you believe you see the world as it is, you tend to defend your perceptions as final truths. But when you understand that the brain interprets, space begins to emerge for questioning, for flexibility, for transformation. You start to observe more and react less. You begin to consider that discomfort may be an internal signal, not external proof. That familiarity may be just an echo of the past, not a confirmation of the present. These accidents also reveal something important about identity. Who you believe yourself to be is, to a large extent, a story built from memories, emotions, and interpretations repeated over time. If these foundations are malleable, then identity is too. Not in the sense of being unstable, but of being continuously constructed. This explains why certain experiences have such an impact. They disrupt the sense of continuity, the idea that there is a solid self, traversing time without interruption. When reality seems to repeat itself, this continuity is momentarily questioned. Something seems out of place. And this feeling, although uncomfortable, is revealing. It shows that the experience of being yourself depends on processes that normally operate beyond the reach of consciousness. Processes that, when they become visible, cause strangeness precisely because they break the illusion of total control. These revelations are not an invitation to extreme skepticism, nor to constant distrust. They are an invitation to awareness. To realize that the brain does the best it can to create meaning, even if this involves shortcuts, adjustments, and sometimes errors. And that these errors are not moral failings or signs of weakness, but natural consequences of a complex system trying to maintain stability in an unpredictable world. When you understand this, you begin to see these experiences in a different way. Instead of fear or confusion, curiosity arises. Instead of rejection, interest arises. Each feeling of repetition, each inexplicable familiarity, each strangeness becomes a window to observe how the mind works. An opportunity to see behind the scenes of the construction of reality in action. This understanding broadens the journey. It changes how you relate to your memories, your decisions, and your certainties. It shows that many truths are contextual, not absolute. That the brain prefers coherent stories to faithful portrayals. And that, by recognizing this, you gain something valuable: the freedom to question, adjust, and choose more consciously. All of this leads us to an even more sensitive and fascinating point. If reality is interpreted, to what extent can we trust the stories we tell ourselves? And what happens when we begin to observe these stories more closely? It is precisely in this territory between interpretation and perceived truth that the human mind reveals its deepest aspects. Before moving forward in this reflection, leave a simple comment below, just to mark this understanding. Comment: "This makes sense to me." When all of this starts to fall into place, a question arises that can no longer be ignored. If the brain can reproduce reality by accident, if it can generate familiarity where there is none, certainty where there is doubt, and repetition where there is only similarity, how many other convictions in our daily lives might simply be well-constructed interpretations? How many decisions that seem obvious, how many certainties that we firmly defend, how many stories that we tell ourselves were born from this same silent mechanism trying to maintain coherence? This reflection isn't meant to create insecurity, but to broaden awareness. Because realizing that reality is interpreted doesn't mean it's false, it means it's mediated. There's a world out there, but it reaches you filtered by attention, emotion, memory, and expectations. The brain doesn't deliver the raw world. It delivers a comprehensible version, organized enough to allow you to function, choose, and move forward. And that, in itself, is a powerful revelation. Throughout life, you learn to trust this version of yourself. You learn to make quick decisions, to recognize patterns, to feel secure in the familiar. This skill builds your mindset, sustains your journey, and gives continuity to your identity. But when these small accidents, these synchronization failures occur, something important happens. The illusion of transparency breaks down. You realize that there is an active backstage operating all the time, editing, adjusting, and sometimes making mistakes. This moment of awareness has an impact. It changes how you relate to your own experiences. Instead of automatically accepting every sensation as proof, you begin to observe. Instead of reacting immediately, you question. Instead of assuming something is true just because it seems familiar, you make room to investigate. This change isn't abrupt, it's subtle. But it transforms your relationship with your own mind. When you understand that the brain prefers consistency to absolute precision, you begin to see why certain internal narratives repeat themselves. Why some thought patterns seem difficult to break. Why similar decisions reappear in different contexts. It's not destiny. It's not a lack of willpower. Often, it's simply the brain reusing what it already knows because it saves energy and reduces uncertainty. Recognizing this gives you back something essential: conscious choice. This awareness also changes how you interpret intense experiences. Those strange sensations cease to be threatening and become informative. They say something about your internal state, your attention, your emotional state. They are signs, not omens. They are windows, not fatal errors. And the more you observe these windows, the more you realize how adaptable, creative, and, at the same time, vulnerable the human mind is to its own shortcuts. There's a hidden truth behind all of this. You don't live within reality, you live within a continuous interpretation of it. And this interpretation changes according to context, fatigue, stress, life stage, and predominant emotions. This explains why the same situation can be experienced in such different ways over time. It explains why what seemed right yesterday sounds strange today. And it explains why some certainties crumble when you look at them more closely. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this understanding opens up something greater than scientific curiosity. It directly touches on how you transform yourself throughout life. When you realize that many convictions are temporary constructs, you gain flexibility. When you understand that familiarity is no guarantee of truth, you gain discernment. When you recognize that emotion can precede logic, you gain responsibility for your own decisions. This journey of understanding doesn't take away the ground beneath our feet, it expands the map. It shows that trusting our senses is important, but questioning them is too. That feeling is essential, but reflection deepens understanding. That the brain is an extraordinary tool but not infallible. And that accepting this imperfection doesn't weaken the human experience, it makes it more conscious, richer, and more honest. Perhaps the most interesting point is realizing that these accidents don't happen to confuse but to reveal. They show how the mind constructs continuity, how it protects identity, and how it tries to keep everything functioning even under pressure. When you see this, you begin to realize that many things that seem solid are, in fact, internal agreements. Agreements that can be revised when they cease to serve their purpose. This perception changes the way you look at the world and at yourself. Not dramatically but constantly. Small choices become more conscious. Automatic reactions begin to be observed. Intense sensations cease to be commands and become information. This change in attitude has a direct impact on how you live, decide, and interpret your own story. And the more you allow yourself to observe these mechanisms, the clearer it becomes that understanding the human mind isn't about finding definitive answers, but about asking better questions. Questions that don't seek total control but understanding. Questions that don't demand absolute certainty but openness. It is in this space that the relationship with reality becomes more mature and less automatic. This reflection doesn't end here because there are still important layers to explore about how these interpretations shape behavior, identity, and choices over time. But before moving forward on this journey, leave a short note in the comments, just to mark this connection with what has been said so far. Write this down: I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this conversation resonated with you on some level. Perhaps a memory, a strange feeling you'd never stop to observe, or simply the curiosity to better understand how the mind works when no one is watching. So, if this message has stayed with you until the end, leave a simple comment below saying, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." It's always interesting to see how each person connects with this topic in a different way. If this video helped you see the brain, reality, or even yourself with a little more clarity, please give it a like. This gesture shows that this type of content has value and helps this conversation continue to reach more people who also enjoy reflecting on the mysteries of the human mind. Now, if you enjoy this type of reflection, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this journey. Here, the idea is always to explore these inner workings of the brain calmly, deeply, and with curiosity, without ready-made answers but with good questions. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic. Click on it and continue watching it with me.